getting older is not a linear path to dementia, and genes are not your destiny.
I'm Jill Angelo, host of the Gennev podcast series for women's health in midlife. I speak with the most forward-thinking experts in the health and wellness industries. These experts are helping women 40 plus feel confident and in control of their health in the most vibrant years of their lives. So join us on this journey of women's health. This next interview is very dear to my heart, as Alzheimer's disease runs in my family. I've seen the devastating effects firsthand. So when I got the chance to interview a leading researcher in Alzheimer's disease prevention, I jumped on it. Dr. Lisa Mosconi is Assistant Professor of Neuroscience and Neurology and the Associate Director of the Alzheimer's Prevention Clinic at Weill Cornell Medical College. She recently published a book called Brain Food: The Surprising Science of Eating for Cognitive Power. In this, part one of our conversation, we talk about the surprising connection between menopause, estrogen, and Alzheimer's risk. Well, Lisa, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. We're going to talk today about menopause and any correlation it might have to brain health and Alzheimer's in particular. This topic hits really personal to me because Alzheimer's is quite prevalent in my family, and I've seen its impacts. And so this is a personal conversation for me today, and I just deeply appreciate the work that you're doing. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
First and foremost, you're an expert in brain science. Help us understand what that means, and how did you get started in this field?
So brain science is really the study of what happens in the brain. And for me, I was particularly interested in the medical applications of that. So my background is in neuroscience and nuclear medicine, which is code for brain imaging. So my work is really focused on detection of whatever goes on inside the brain from a structural, functional, and chemical perspective, all of them. And how I started, my parents are nuclear physicists, both of them. And they introduced me to nuclear medicine very early on because my mother was teaching nuclear physics to medical doctors and to physicists that then transitioned to medicine. So I started very early on. And pretty much when I started my PhD, my grandmother started showing signs of cognitive decline and cognitive impairment. And within a matter of years, she just transition to full-blown dementia. So almost by chance, I had started working in Alzheimer's during my PhD. I was actually working on the prevention of Alzheimer's and early detection of Alzheimer's. And just around the same time, my grandma was pretty much a textbook case of what happens to somebody with dementia. And it was terrible. It was terrible to witness, not just on her, but on my family as well. And that was really, she had Alzheimer's, so dementia, probably it was mixed dementia with a strong vascular component. And her sister had exactly the same. And then her younger sister developed that too. So like you were saying about your family, you really want to protect your parents. At that point, you want to make sure that, in my case, my mother would not have to go through that, and that I wouldn't have to go through that, and that my daughter will not have to go through that. So prevention has been the main focus of my research ever since I started. And I moved to New York 15 years ago at this point to really have the opportunity to do more and better research, because Italy is Italy. You're lucky if you have any money at all for research, and that's why I moved here and I never left. So I started at NYU School of Medicine, and now I'm working at Weill Cornell Medical Center, and I'm the associate director of the Alzheimer's Prevention Clinic at Weill Cornell, and it's the first Alzheimer's prevention clinic in the country.
Wow. So how, speaking about Alzheimer's for a moment, how many How many Americans or even people worldwide does it affect?
Currently, it's 46 million Alzheimer's patients worldwide. And what is even more terrifying in some ways is that the number of cases is estimated to increase to 130 million by the year 2050. Yes, it's really an epidemic. We're facing an epidemic, and I think we're not prepared.
In your work, would you say it's all around looking at causation or things that cause that are going to contribute to that incredible growth in Alzheimer's?
Yes, our work is definitely focused on identifying all possible risk factors for Alzheimer's, all the factors that will make you develop Alzheimer's, even if you don't have a genetic mutation that is causative of Alzheimer's. And this is really important because when I started about 15 years ago, most people would think about Alzheimer's as either an inevitable consequence of getting older or as a consequence of bad genes in your DNA, or both. And it turns out neither one of these alternatives is really true, and that getting older is not a linear path to dementia, and genes are not your destiny. In fact, 1% of the population develop Alzheimer's because of genetic mutations. 1%, no more than that. For 99% of us, of course, your genetics play a role on some level. They can put you at risk, they can give you higher risk, lower risk, but they're not the entire story. And your lifestyle and your environment play a huge role that was always underestimated until very recently. So what we have learned is that 1 in every 3 Alzheimer's cases could be prevented by addressing lifestyle and medical factors like factors for cardiovascular risk, but also lifestyle in terms of exercise, intellectual stimulation, and perhaps most of all, diet.
Do you think we'll ever get to the point where Alzheimer's is 99% preventable?
Well, I think that's optimistic, but I think we can probably shoot for 30 to 50%, depending on who's looking at it. The most conservative estimate is 30%. The most optimistic estimate at this point is 50% preventable. And look, it's great, right? It's 75 million people. That would be fantastic, I think.
It sounds like there's so many corollary factors, and I think we're going to need another podcast just on all of that. But today, let's talk a little bit about the relationship between Alzheimer's and menopause. You recently published a piece titled Alzheimer's and Women's Health, an Urgent Call. To me, that seems alarming. Can you explain a little bit about your findings and what you've learned?
Yes, gladly, and thank you for the question. So, as scientists, we have long known that female sex is a major risk factor for Alzheimer's. So the number 1 risk factor is aging, but the number 2, so the second most important risk factor, is actually being a woman. And for many, many years, nobody looked into why. And this is alarming because of every 3 Alzheimer's patients, 2 are women. Everywhere in the world, so regardless of geography, regardless of cultural background, regardless of a variety of factors, Alzheimer's affects more women than men. And people can say, oh, that's because women live longer, and they just set it aside and say, oh, well, just because you guys live longer, but that is just so not the case. Because, so women outnumber men 2 to 1 in the Alzheimer's population, and this is already accounting for the increased longevity relative to men. So you can look at that in any age group. Like if you look at people who are 60 to 70 or 65 to 75, 75 to 85, at any age range is exactly the same ratio. Out of every 3 patients with Alzheimer's, 2 are women, 1 is a man. So, and also if you control for that statistically, like we do with survival analysis, accounting for mortality rates and it's exactly the same story. So it's not just that we live longer. There is something about just being a woman that puts us at higher risk for Alzheimer's as compared to men. And that is really important because it doesn't happen for other neurological diseases. It's only for Alzheimer's. Like if you look at vascular dementia, it's not the same rate. If you look at Parkinson's disease, actually more men suffer than women. So there's really a strong connection between female sex and Alzheimer's, and we just did not know what it was. What we thought was, so for a really long time, people thought of Alzheimer's as something that just turns on when we're older. And all my work has always been about early detection, like how early on can I catch signs of future Alzheimer's? And because we're using brain imaging techniques, we can really track development of Alzheimer's in brain from like when people are in their 30s and 40s and 50s. And what we have found and what other people have found is that Alzheimer's is not a disease of old age. It starts in midlife with changes in the brain. When you don't have cognitive symptoms, you have no clinical symptoms, you have no cognitive decline whatsoever, but it's already inside your head. And then it takes 20 years before the brain basically gives up and has no more reserve to withstand it, and then people develop symptoms. So there's a 20 years gap between the onset of changes in the brain and the onset of clinical symptoms. And sure enough, what happens only to women and not to men when they turn 45, 50? They go through menopause.
So that's when you said, okay, that's the unique thing that women go through and men don't. You said, let's look at this. Let's look at it deeper.
Yes. And I was amazed that so little had been done. It's such an obvious conclusion to reach, right? And there was so little done to really look into that. And so one reason that we thought, we should really investigate that is that estrogen is not just involved in fertility. Estrogen plays a huge role in the brain all the time, throughout our lives, like from the minute you're born to the very last minute of your life. Estrogen plays a huge role, and in particular, it is neuroprotective. So it literally shields your brain from harm. So as you go through menopause, there's a decline in estrogen levels. And that affects your fertility and your ability to have kids. But at the same time, it gives all sorts of neurological symptoms that are just not thought of as neurological. So when women suffer from hot flashes, those are not in your ovaries. Those start in your brain, right? When you go through menopause and you develop insomnia, depression, confusion, night sweats, memory loss for some women, not loss, but memory declines, memory impairment. That's not because of your ovaries. That's because of your brain. There's something going on in your brain that is not making it function as well as it used to. And that's because estrogen plays such a huge role as a neuroprotective agent and also as a stimulant. It literally stimulates certain parts of your brain to be active and to be metabolically engaged. So as the estrogen goes down, as women, we lose protection, and that leaves us more vulnerable to brain aging and dementia.
So the first question that pops to my mind is, what about men? Like, do they never have that kind of protection, or what's protecting their brain?
Testosterone. Men have more of a balance between estrogen, testosterone, progesterone. They're not as dependent on estrogen as we are. And also, men go through andropause when they're like 70. So whatever changes they experience are milder and later on in time. Also, their estrogen levels don't go down. They start low and just remain whatever level. We knew from animal studies that the menopause transition has an impact in brain physiology. Now, these are studies in mice. And as a neuroscientist who works with people, I can tell you whatever happens in mice does not necessarily happen in people. So we started with those studies because they're fantastic, and they were mostly carried out by a wonderful friend of mine, Dr. Roberta Diaz Brinton at the University of Arizona. She's incredible, and she's such a powerhouse in so many ways. She's just a fantastic person, such a strong advocate for women's health. And she actually came up to me when I was giving a talk at some conference, and she said to me, "What do you think about menopause and Alzheimer's risk?" And I was like, nothing. And she's like, "Well, you should, because we have shown this, and that." And it was such incredible new research that I was immediately interested. And I said to her, so what they're showing is that in female mice, so mice don't go through menopause naturally as we do. You have to induce it. And once you induce menopause, their brains kind of shut down. You can tell there's a very sudden reduction in brain activity that is related to a suppression of mitochondrial function. Now, mitochondria are the little parts, they're like little organelles inside our cells that are responsible for production of energy. So the mitochondria kind of slow down, our ability to produce energy also slows down. This is everywhere in the body and the brain. So they showed that menopause really triggers a kind of bioenergetic crisis in the brain of mice. And she said to me, "I would love to see what happens in women." And so we did it. We ran one of the very first studies with women. Actually, I think probably the first one with women prior to menopause. So we studied healthy women without Alzheimer's, without any cognitive impairment, and they were all 40 to 60 years old. Some were premenopausal, meaning they had no symptoms whatsoever. They were doing fantastic. Some were perimenopausal, so they were starting to show signs of menopause, and some were postmenopausal. And we also had a group of men of the same age and educational level, so that we matched them. They would be like our controls. And we measured a lot of things. We measured in everybody. We looked at clinical measurements, cognitive performance, lab tests, all sorts of lab tests, cholesterol, homocysteine, vitamin B12, etc. But most importantly, we did brain imaging on all of them. So we looked at their brain structure, if their brains showed any sign of atrophy, which is like a proxy for neuronal loss. We looked at brain glucose metabolism, which is an indicator of how active their brains are. And also we looked at Alzheimer's pathology. We can do brain scans and take a picture of whatever is in the brain, and if you show any Alzheimer's plaques in your brain, we will see them on the scans, and we can quantify how much you have of that pathology. And we also measured mitochondrial activity. So we had a lot of information, and no matter how you slice it, postmenopausal and perimenopausal women showed on average 45% lower mitochondrial activity than premenopausal women. And they showed reduced brain activity by 30%. And the postmenopausal women also showed a lot more amyloid than the premenopausal women and men of the same exact age.
Those are big gaps. When you think about that disparity and that difference in the impact and the vulnerability now that we have in our brains to Alzheimer's, begs the question, should I be taking hormones? Or, what can I be doing as a woman? And so many women are conflicted about hormone replacement therapy. And what's your point of view on that? Did you have any conclusions around that at this point?
I've done research on that because, in 10 years, I'll be perimenopausal and I want to be prepared. So I looked into that because that was exactly my question for Dr. Brinter, for Robbie, when she contacted me. I said, well, so what do we do? And my understanding from the media, I guess, was that HRT, or estrogen replacement therapy, or hormonal therapy, increased risk of breast cancer. Mm-hmm. And pretty much that's what everybody thinks. And she got so frustrated. She's like, another one. And she said to me, go, just figure it out. Just read, and then we'll talk about it. And there's really...
And you will, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you will hear a lot of, OBGYNs or MDs, really, they're supportive of hormone replacement therapy in the right way, provided. And so I can see where her frustration came from.
Yes, I think it was misinformation and how... So actually, I was talking to the chairman of my department, who's really supportive of our work and really wants to promote what we're doing. And he was saying to me, look, many years ago, in like 2002 and 2004, there were very big clinical trials that were like interrupted almost overnight. The Women Health Initiative trials, because they did report that women who were taking the combination therapy, so estrogen and progestin, they showed an increased rate of breast cancer and an increased incidence of breast cancer, whereas women who were only taking estrogen did not. Actually, they showed reduced incidence of breast cancer, but that was enough for the media to basically sound the alarm. And if I understood correctly, a lot of people actually sued the pharmaceutical companies, or there was some kind of so they just interrupted the trials. And I would say those trials were not perfectly designed because they looked at women who were fairly old. They were 50 to 79. So they were already post-menopause. Actually, they were not old. I'm sorry. 50 is not old. Terrible thing to say.
It's not old anymore. It's a lot younger than it used to be.
Absolutely. But I meant,
Good correction.
Well, from an endocrine perspective, 50 is not young. So, they were just post-menopausal. And there is evidence from follow-up studies. What they showed was an increased risk of cardiovascular events for both groups. So regardless of whether you were on estrogen only or estrogen and progestin, they really showed increased risk of cardiovascular events, and that was also a big concern. But there's evidence that if you start therapy prior to menopause, the risk of cardiovascular disease is actually reduced. And even if you start HRT after menopause, but not later than 9 years post-menopause, there seems to be still benefit. So I think what we need is more research at this point. Mm-hmm. I think the risk of cancer is scary for everybody, and I think there's a lot of thought that needs to go into that. Like, if you have a uterus, then estrogen alone is problematic. If you had a hysterectomy, then you can tolerate it without necessarily developing cancer. But it's also really important, I think, to do genetic testing and see if you have any genetic risk factors for ovarian cancer or breast cancer. And that's something that we need to know prior to starting any therapy. Obviously, if it runs in your family, then you know that you are
predisposed,
sensitive to estrogen replacement therapy. You know that. If you carry the Angelina Jolie gene, for instance, right? That's a big red flag. So the BRCA gene, if you're positive for that, then I would say you shouldn't take estrogens. But for people who don't test positive for those genetic markers, then I think we need more research, and we need to understand when to initiate therapy, what kind of dosage, what's the source of the estrogens. Right? Many formulations are from horses. Is that the best way? Could we take phytoestrogens, for instance, from plants? Would that be more gentle on the body? Or, I think there are so many questions that we're just not asking. And it's a pity because everybody goes through menopause. Everybody. It's insane that there is no relief.
Yeah, whether you experience the symptoms or not, every woman or any person with a uterus goes through menopause.
Yes, absolutely. But also, I would say 80% of women do have symptoms. It's only about 20% who just breeze through it, like my mom. Yeah. But 80% is a lot. I think there are 850 million women in the world who are entering menopause or just entered menopause. and we have no ways to help them.
Thanks for listening to part 1 of our conversation. In part 2, Dr. Lisa fills us in on the foods that help nourish our hungry brains and the foods to avoid to stay sharp. You truly can lower your risk of cognitive decline, so tune in for part 2 to find out how. Thanks for listening to the Gennev podcast series. We welcome your feedback at gennev.com. That's GENNEVE.com. You can follow us on Facebook and subscribe to us on iTunes or Stitcher, and you'll never miss an episode. The Gennev podcast series is produced by Shannon Perry, theme music by Smitty. And until next time, watch the Gennev website for new stories and offers all dedicated to women's midlife health.